Welcome to this meeting of Audit and Governance. So, moving to the agenda, first item on the agenda is apologies for absence.
Well, I haven't received any, but I can see that we've got two. Rishi Fernando, perhaps apologies. And I haven't heard from Andrew Huggins, so that's one definitely.
Okay, thank you. The next item on the agenda, item 2, is the minutes from the last meeting held on the 15th of November, and they begin on page 6 of the pack. I'll be happy that they are a correct record of the meeting. Thank you. And seconder from Councillor Ward Booth. Yeah. All those in favour? Thank you. That's carried. Thank you very much indeed. Item 3 is Chairman's announcements. No announcements really, but just to remind members to use their microphones when they're speaking, as this meeting is being webcast. Thank you. Item 4, declarations of interest. Any declarations? No. If anything comes to mind as we go along, perhaps we can just mention it. So item 5 will be the item on the Hertfordshire Waste Partnership.
Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Jones, thanks very much for coming. Welcome to the meeting. Thank you.
So tonight I'm going to concentrate on the significant changes to how finances in the waste sector work and how they're going to change based on some new legislation that's going to start coming out this year after the last sort of 3 or 4 years of consultation. But just to very quickly set the scene to give you a context, the Hertfordshire Waste Partnership is made up of Hertfordshire's 10 boroughs and districts plus the county council, so 11 statutory waste authorities, including the boroughs as collection authorities and the county council as the disposal authority. Collectively, we spend around about £87 million a year, and you can roughly split that in half on disposal, half on collection and street cleansing. Our recycling rate for 21-22 is 52.7%, our highest rate ever. 7 years in a row now, we've been above 50%, but we expect via something called the consistency agenda that by the end of March, government will confirm a new target of 65% by 2035, but that's going to cover both household and municipal waste. Most of the household waste in Hertfordshire actually doesn't go to landfill. It goes to either recycling, composting, or our use of energy recovery in regional facilities. So we send very little to landfill historically. Last year, we dealt with over 500,000 tonnes of household waste that arose across the county, both at the curbside and through the network of household waste recycling centres run by the county council. If I can just quickly finish the context by showing you what the HWP looks like in kilograms per household. So the top 2 graphs there are both total household waste. So that's everything we collect, including recycling and composting on the left. And the red line on the right-hand side is residual waste. In both those graphs, the time period is 2010-11 to projected numbers by the end of the current financial year, hence the hash lines you can see. That little awkward kick on the right-hand side, that is COVID. So when we all went back indoors 7 days a week, we didn't go out, we didn't socialise. We shopped based on living in our houses and cooking 3 meals a day. That gave us a very rapid increase in our total household waste arising and our residual waste arising. But you can see with the Excel straight linear trend lines added that actually by the end of the current financial year, we're forecasting to be significantly below where the long-term trend was. So a range of factors, cost of living being one of those, has resulted in not only current tonnages more than compensating for the increase during the COVID period, but we've now gone significantly or projecting to go significantly below that. Performance is reflected in the bottom 2 graphs. The one on the left, the blue line is recycling. The one on the green line is organics. Organics is largely made up of garden waste, but there is 25,000 tonnes of food waste in there. Organics is slightly strange in that it's dependent on weather. Everything else in those graphs is depending on how much money we have in our pocket. If we feel rich, we spend it, we consume. If we don't feel rich, we don't spend, and we don't consume, we don't create waste. Therefore, combining those stats, you can see that even though up until the end of last year, on the right-hand side there at the bottom, we've had an ever increasing recycling rate, we're actually looking at a potential drop by the end of March this year, end of the financial year. So that sets the context. So there are two big financial transfers that happen between the County Council, boroughs and districts in Hertfordshire. And this is a situation on this slide, the recycling credits, which is replicated across the country. It's a statutory obligation. County Council has no choice. They have to pay boroughs and districts a recycling credit. The way it's calculated is based on disposal costs, but the calculation is prescribed in law and it's automatically indexed at 3% per annum. It's a two-tier payment arrangements. Two tiers can agree alternative arrangements, but it takes unanimous agreement to do so. But the interesting point here for me is it's raised on the council tax. So if you think about the head of waste up at the County Council, has his budget for the year, and as part of that, he will calculate, based on projections he gets from the districts, how much recycling tonnage he will handle, or the partnership will handle, and therefore what budget to raise for that via his part of the council tax process. But it's paid out on performance. So the basis on which it's raised is fundamentally different to the basis on which it's paid out. And straight away, you have the right situations for a cross subsidy. So in essence, recycling credits is a transfer of money from the lower performing authorities in Hertfordshire to the higher performing ones. Because of that, because of the difference in the way the money is raised compared to the way it's paid out. Fundamentally, whilst the County Council, nor myself as the partnership manager, get involved in the nitty-gritty of local authority accounting, the idea of the recycling credit payment system is it goes towards your waste service budget and is therefore used to reduce the net cost of your service. The graph there simply shows you the recycling credits in actual spend or money, if you like, from the district point of view, again, from 2708 up until a projected figure for the end of this year. And you can see the peak there, again, was COVID, when people were recycling a lot of stuff because they were at home 7 days a week. In essence, during COVID, a lot of the waste consumption in the commercial sector, so think pubs, restaurants, places you'd go out to socialize, that waste was transferred to the domestic scene. So it dropped last year in 21-22 as we started to open up again, and we're projecting a further drop for the year that we're about to finish. And the table on the right-hand side gives you the recycling credit payments for 21-22, and you can see, you know, for many authorities there, that's quite a substantial sum of money, but it's not needed largely under something called EPR, and I'll come on to that in a second. The second major financial transfer between the County Council and boroughs and districts is something called the alternative financial model. Now, this is specific to Hertfordshire. You won't find this model anywhere else in the country. This was implemented over 10 years ago because we recognized that the statutory recycling credit system wasn't really going to support people pushing up beyond 50% recycling. And as I'm sure you know, in Hertfordshire, we've had two authorities in the English top 10 for the last couple of years, Three Rivers and St Albans, who are recycling above 60%. And so the AFM was really instigated to provide that additional funding. It's based on passing back to the boroughs and districts any savings that the Waste Disposal Authority, the County Council, made as a result of borough and district activity, with 90% of those savings being passed back. Again, similar to recycling credits, the money was assumed to go back into your waste budgets to reduce the net cost, but under EPR is also not needed. And this year is the last year of the scheme. It's been terminated going forward. So, quick summary of what the sort of key financial issues are. And a lot of these are related to something called the Resources and Waste Strategy. The government published it at the back end of 2018, and we've spent the last 4-5 years consulting with the government through two separate rounds of consultation on what the final proposal should look like. Back in March last year, we had the EPR response, and I'll come on to that in a sec. And just last Friday, we finally got the government's DRS response. and we now await the consistency response. And those are three key arms of the government's approach, and I'll summarise those in a second for you. But just going across the top there, you've got closure of the AFM. At its height, it was worth over £4 million per annum. That's money that will no longer flow to the boroughs and districts. Recycling credits is something that the county council legally has to continue to pay at the moment, unless legislation changes, and that represents a significant financial transfer. Impact of DRS, deposit return schemes. Yeah, I can just about remember taking my empty glass bottle back to the corner shop to redeem my deposit. The government are proposing to bring that system back. And as a result, the response that was published on Friday, I had to do a very quick rewrite of tonight's presentation. I have a couple of slides where I will go into more detail for you. But in terms of deposit return schemes, the key message I'd like this group to go away with is loss of income, because materials, predominantly high value materials, are highly likely to be diverted away from local authority control. EPR funding. So at the moment, the public purse picks up about 1.5 to 2 billion pounds worth of cost each year in dealing with the disposal and recycling of post-consumer packaging. The EPR funding scheme proposes to push that cost onto the private sector, and local authorities will get funding from a privately funded pot based on what producers place on the market in terms of recyclable material. I've got a quick slide to show you and demonstrate some of the end market volatility that we have to deal with as officers. So if we go back probably 10 months, we were generating a net income from the materials collecting at the curbside. We're now back into a net cost situation because of international forces. Inflation, well, you don't need me to tell you about inflation. I'm sure as members you've been dealing with that. You all realise the impact on the budgets and on local authority budgets, whether it's disposal or collection. That's been very, very significant. EFWs in the ETS, emission trading scheme. So the government, as part of climate change legislation, is looking to put waste disposal, energy from waste facilities into that scheme. Again, that's just going to be an additional cost that we pick up as local government. And more recently, with operational changes starting at the end of December, we're now having to handle waste upholstered furnishings separately because of something called POPs, persistent organic pollutants. The one I've highlighted at the bottom, garden waste charges. This has been an ongoing question over the last 3 or 4 years since the original consultation came out. Will the government allow district councils to charge for garden waste? And you will know better than me how much income your authority gets from that mechanism. One of the questions that was left open in the consultation was the government were considering mandating that to be a free service. Again, a significant loss of income. We were made aware of a letter, and I'll come to that later on, by one of the relevant ministers in response to a question from an ex-minister who had been lobbying on behalf of a local authority in his area and had sent a letter in February last year. The response came out in December, so just last month, where the minister confirmed that the government was going to move away from that proposal and local authorities would be able to retain the ability to charge. I would urge you not to take that at face value at present, because the consultation response for consistency is not yet out. And until it is, I would be happy planning on the basis of being able to generate income over the next couple of years. So the resources and waste strategy, I've mentioned it a few times, has 3 elements. Consistency. This is about local government collecting the same range of materials, regardless of where you live in the country. The method can be different, but it's the same range. One of the biggest complaints that the government received from the general public is I have to recycle a different level of material based on where I live. And the government have finally taken action and will legislate a core set that all local authorities will have to collect by, we think, hence the question marks, 2024, with separate food waste collections, which we now know are required by March 2025. That's hot off the press last week, and that includes flats. Deposit return schemes, that is slated to start in October 2025, so best part of 2 and a bit years away. Lots of work to do between then. It's an all-in model, So it will apply to materials that you traditionally recycle at the curbside or you may consume when you're out and about, what we refer to as on the go. But in England and Northern Ireland, glass will not be included, where it will be in Scotland and Wales. And there you have the first big hole in the government's proposals, because none of the retail associations are supporting this. While waste is a devolved matter, clearly pre-consumer materials and post-consumer materials in the form of waste do every single day of the week cross borders. So imagine that distribution warehouse in Berwick-upon-Tweed. In the northern part of the warehouse, you'll have the Coca-Cola bottle with the Scottish label. Then you'll have the southern part of the warehouse with the Coca-Cola bottle with the English label, and you can see what's going to happen. You know, Scotland will get England's derivative and vice versa. So none of the retail associations privately are supporting this. So I personally think there is further parts of the story to come on DRS. But if it goes forward as planned for local authorities, waste collection authorities, so you as East Herts are a waste collection authority, you stand to lose income because things like aluminium cans, if DRS is successful, will get diverted to a deposit return scheme. You will not be picking it up at the curbside. And for for disposal authorities, they're likely to save money because more material will be diverted from the residual waste stream. Extended producer responsibility. We think the implementation is April 2024. At that point, your authority will be paid on a tonnage basis quarterly in arrears by the scheme administrator set up to manage EPR. So you can access the funding from what we call the EPR pot, but it will come with conditions. So what are those key things to take away for you? So I've mentioned the garden waste charge, and I'm not going to mention it again. The scheme administrator for EPR is going to be a public body, therefore fulfilling that function now, but it will cover all three devolved administrations as well as England. But the funding from the EPR fund will be subject to you providing an efficient and an effective service. And one of the questions you now want to ask me, which is very reasonable, is what does that mean? You know, how does Jess define, as the head of service for East Herts, what an efficient and effective service is, and therefore do they comply, do they get full access to the money? We still don't know. Despite asking the government for the last 2 or 3 years what that means in practice, they still cannot tell us. We believe the scheme administrator will have it on their to-do list. So we know there is funding changes, we know they are very significant, but we don't know yet enough detail to advise members in terms of local policy. But the scheme administrator will be required, once they're up and running, to provide forecasting for future payments to age and budget management. Right, deposit return scheme. So the response finally came out on Friday. It has 2 key objectives with it. One, to improve performance. You think, well, in that case, why is glass not included on a national basis? And 2, to reduce litter. Around 45% of the litter on the ground is stuff that will go through a DRS, whether it's a can, a glass bottle, or a plastic bottle. So the idea, if you put a deposit on it, people will stop littering, they'll retain hold of it, and they'll be able to take it back to one of any number of return points that will be set up to service these proposals. That's the idea. So now that the consultation is finished and the response has been published, we expect the legislation by the end of this calendar year. We expect the deposit management organization or organizations, the government have left open the door to multiple organizations helping to run this, to be appointed by next summer. And I do mean appointed. I don't mean winning a tender situation. They're going to have some sort of interview application process and will be appointed. That's different to what they said in the consultation. That's new. With the all-in scheme starting in October 2025, Scotland are much further ahead and they're launching this August, which will be good because we'll see how it goes. And if it goes fantastically well, then clearly there'll be lots of learning opportunities. There'll also be learning opportunities if it doesn't go so well. In England and Northern Ireland, it will only apply to steel and aluminium cans and plastic bottles. Size 50 mils to 3 litres. So one of the things we'll be watching for as waste professionals is those producers to start to produce the 49 millimetre bottle to avoid their responsibilities, which in process terms is clearly easy to do. But those are the conditions that have been set. But we believe the glass will be a major sticking point with industry because it does not make logistical sense to have 2 or possibly even 3 different DRSs evolving across the UK. The maximum limit for a deposit will be set in the legislation, but under that, the DMO is free to decide what the deposit should be under the maximum and how to apply it. So the key issues from a local government perspective is the response hasn't in any way, shape or form addressed any of the concerns that local authorities have raised to date. We also know from a meeting earlier today that on the DMO, there will be no place on the board, if you like, even in an advisory capacity for any local government organisation. And by then, I mean the professional bodies, ADEPT, Nordo, LARAC, those senior professional organisations that look after the waste issue for local government. As local authorities, even if there is a DRS, if a DRS is up and running and is successful, you can still imagine there will be some DRS in scope material ending up at the curbside that you'll collect. The government say to us, we are free to do whatever we want to redeem those deposits, but there's no detail on how we might do that. Now, clearly, they don't mean collection operatives literally scanning and weighing individual materials. So those conversations are still to be had because the detail has not been provided. In terms of the income you get from your what we call your basket value, if you think about cans and plastic bottles, currently, if you looked at the way the basket is made up, because it does change, 75% of the income from your curbside operation could disappear. Yeah, because there's a difference between tonnage and value. The value is made up, it has a different split across the materials compared to what the tonnage does. So aluminium, potentially worth at the moment £1,100 a tonne on the open market. If you assume a 20p deposit on a can of aluminium can of pop drink, and 20p is the deposit they're going to go for in Scotland, if I've done my sums right, a tonne of aluminium becomes worth £14,000 to £15,000 overnight once the scheme is up and running. But how we realise that operationally and how you write a contract such that both you and your contractor can benefit and therefore you're jointly motivated to do this is yet to be looked at. And there's also a potential funding gap. One of the things we said from day one to government is that both EPR and DRS should apply to DRS materials. So if you didn't go through the DRS system, you'd get EPR funding. The government have reneged on that, to be blunt. So from April 2024, there will be no EPR funding for things like plastic bottles, either at the curbside, whether it's being recycled or it's in the residual waste. And also the EPR itself starts in 24, but the DRS starts in 2025. So there's an 18-month gap there where the funding situation is currently unclear, and we're assuming it's going to be plugged by the existing revenue support grant system if you still get it. And just to finish off that point, for some parts of the DRS system, in terms of what retailers have to do to provide take-back points, that will be regulated by trading standards, but no announcement on whether they'll be funded to be able to do that work. So this slide here, just to finish off, is about market volatility as we're talking about funding. So this is January 22. So this time last year on the left-hand slide, ending in December last month. The first red line on the bottom is 0. The second red line is our current gate fee for the HWP MRF consortium, which currently includes Dacorum, Three Rivers, Watford and Welling Hatfield. You have a similar approach in East Hearts, but for the HWP consortium, you can see that for the first sort of 2/3 of the year, we are achieving a net income above the line based on the value of the material. But then that slipped back below the line starting in September. If you bear in mind that, you know, for Christmas in terms of production, Christmas in the Far East is around about August time, where they start to make the stuff that we consume at Christmas before it's put on a ship. So demand always tails off at that time of year. But that is just a quick illustration of the sort of market volatilities that we have to deal with as officers in terms of managing the budgets. And just to leave you with a bit of a final thought, I've talked mainly tonight about dry recycling, cans, plastic bottles. This table here is taken from a waste compositional analysis that we conducted in 2020, where we basically, through a standardized, nationally recognized methodology, took samples from a number of different waste streams across most of the partner authorities. And we split out into the key categories what sort of tonnage was left to go and recycle. And if you look at the East Hearts total, at the time of the study, there was about 12,300 tons of material in your residual waste stream that could have gone to recycling. And tonight I've been banging on about cans. Look at the table. For East Hearts, 567 tons. Okay, interesting. Plastics, a bit higher, just over 1,000 tons. Yeah. One of your key challenges is the top red circle under East Hearts, 8,300 tons of food waste. When someone says to me, Duncan, what's your top 3 wants for the next 3 to 5 years? It's food waste, it's food waste, it's food waste. If we don't get the food waste question right, it doesn't matter if we go and get all the other dry recycling, because it's more than dwarfed by the amount of food waste. If you look at the far right-hand table, across Hertfordshire, when we did the study, there's about 84,000 tons of material that could have been diverted. 52,000 tons of that is food, which is why if you ever see me out at roadshows, I'm obsessing about food waste, both in terms of avoiding it in the first place, because even when we recycle it, we're still depending on vehicles, crews, and mechanical processes. But if it has to arise, if we have to collect it, then making sure we compost it. That's just a quick slide to advertise our standing annual report on the web. And that's just a shameless advert for myself. If you're part of any local groups that you run, environmental groups, we're always happy to come out and do talks on recycling, fly tipping, literally anything to do with waste. Just contact us and we can set that up for you, either online or ideally in person. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It's incredibly interesting. Thank you. Members, are there any questions? I could ask, you mentioned about the AFM it's being phased out. I gather that's kind of a budget sort of, the reason for that is budget related with the county. Is there anything going to replace that?
No, Chair, and you're absolutely right. It is basically a budget issue. We've had the AFM in place for about the last 13, 14 years. The current model is about the fifth evolution of the model. And every time it's evolved, it's when we spotted a bit of an issue with it, that an unfairness, if you like. But given, like everybody else, the massive inflationary impact, and it was a voluntary model, there's no statute that sits behind it. It was one of those things that had to be cut, unfortunately. But no, there is nothing to replace it. If EPR works as intended, if you consider the AFM as a voluntary thing, but recycling credits as a statutory thing, in theory, their net impact is simply to reduce your service net cost. In theory, under EPR, that shouldn't matter, because if your net cost goes up, until at least Friday, the idea was that EPR would fund the packaging element of that. And most of what we pick up at the curbside is packaging. So you could argue that, across the next 3 to 5 years, that will work itself out within the system. The DRS proposals on Friday that confirmed that there will be no EPR funding for that material is a surprise. So yes, there is a chance there'll be a gap going forward, but there'll be nothing to replace it from a county council perspective.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Chair. Do you mind
Yes,
if I?
of course.
Yeah, thank you. Just really to also partly answer the question around the AFM. My role in county is exec member for the environment, so waste disposal comes under that. And I also chair the Hearts Waste Partnership. And we've been having discussions with all of the districts and boroughs, I believe, over a period of time. And I think there was an expectation that the original purpose of the alternative financial model was no longer really valid, and it was getting towards the end of its life. And again, my understanding was that in fact, all of the districts and boroughs were no longer assuming that they would receive it, and if they did, it was a kind of an extra, so it wasn't being a budgeted item. We thought about it very carefully at county. In my capacity as an exec member, I wrote to all of the portfolio holders across the districts and boroughs. Officers likewise did the same, and there were no objections that came into it. But the important thing, as Duncan mentioned earlier, is that the recycling credits will still be applied because they are still a statutory obligation, and they're still a substantial amount of money. So that's the important thing. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Councillor Bell.
I think the last slide about the statistics with the percentage of waste that should really have been in the recycling that ended up in general waste. The food waste slide, was that data collected before or after we changed our policy on green bins?
Sorry, through you, Chair. The study was conducted, the physical sorting was conducted in September, October 2020. I can't remember, was that before or after?
We went live in April 21.
Yeah.
Okay, so that would presumably that would be even worse now because people aren't allowed to put food waste in their green bins anymore, even the ones that pay for them.
Without measuring, it's hard to answer your question. My experience would be if it's worse, it would only be marginal. One of the reasons that you go separate food waste collections is that we know historically from doing similar studies that the capture of food waste when you co-collect with garden waste is historically quite low. So I would suggest if it has worsened, it's a marginal impact at best, but without actually measuring it before and after, it's hard to answer your question in detail.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor McAndrew.
Yeah, just on food waste, you mentioned under consistency that March 2025, I believe, that the government have said we've got to collect food waste. I haven't had the opportunity to have a conversation with Jess on this, but we have got a new contract coming on board in April 2025. Will there be, are you aware of any leeway on the collection of food waste for 1 month? Because to get a fleet of vehicles in with one contractor isn't sort of quite sort of the same if we are going to change the contract. Duncan, can you sort of advise?
Again, good question through you, Chair. That leeway is being sought. I wasn't at the meeting this morning, but I've been led to believe that officers from the East Arts and North Arts lobbied very effectively, along with colleagues across the country, for exactly that sort of pragmatic approach with DEFRA. It's a suggestion that's come from elsewhere across the UK. So there's a lot of people saying the same thing. We don't know yet what DEFRA will do. The consistency response, so we've had EPR and deposit return schemes, but part of the common response that's gone back so far from the professional associations is it's all meaningless without knowing what consistency says. And under that agenda, we now believe consistency will be published sometime in March. So there is an opportunity to lobby for it, and people are doing so currently, but we don't know yet how DEFRA are going to react.
Councillor Crofton, I believe you had a question.
Very interesting presentation. It's a bit worrying in some respects as well, particularly with that garden waste, the food waste. Can you just, for my sake, because I do get a lot of people say, why can't we compost food waste with garden recycling? What is the reason behind doing it? But another question is, what's your position on glass recycling? Because, you know, as a child, glass recycling for all bottles and lemonade bottles and everything was normal, standard, 3p a bottle, if I remember rightly. And it encouraged people to pick stuff up from the side of the road and take it down to the local shop and make a few pennies. But what's your position, and have you any influence to actually get manufacturers to take responsibility because you'd have a crate for Coca-Cola and you'd have a crate for Corona or whatever it was, and when the manufacturer delivered their product, they'd take the old case away. Simple. What's your position on that, please?
Again, through you, Chair, to answer the food waste and the garden waste question, we know historically, again, through compositional studies and operational practice, when you co-collect food with garden waste, you simply don't get a good enough capture rate. We don't motivate the householders to recycle enough of their food waste, which is why as a country, we've gone down the separate food waste route, and why for the first time ever, the government actually specified a collection frequency. So for when we provide food waste collections from March 2025 onwards, it will have to be a weekly collection, because again, we know comparing separate food waste services that are now running elsewhere in the country, you get a much higher capture rate compared to when it was collected with garden waste. In terms of glass, to be fair to the government, when we responded as a partnership, we also supported the non-inclusion of glass in a scheme, because in Hertfordshire, our capture rate, so by doing the study and knowing the tonnage that we pick up in terms of residual waste and through our recycling, we were able to calculate our capture rate for recycling glass was 92%. So for every 100 tons of glass that was put onto the market in a domestic setting, we captured for recycling 92% from our current system. The government's proposals are going to cost billions of pounds, and they were targeting a 90% recycling rate by the third year. So we're already doing 92%. Why would we support a scheme that was looking to spend billions of pounds to achieve less over a period of time? So that's why we didn't support it. However, in terms of influence, there is a big number of organizations, many representing retailers and producers, now lining up. And they've been saying, to be fair, they've been saying the same thing ever since the original strategy came out in 2018. And the main message is you cannot allow separate DRS schemes to evolve just because waste is a devolved matter, because waste doesn't stop at the border. It never has, it never will. And that theoretical scenario I gave you, where there's a cock up in the warehouse on a Monday morning and the wrong stuff goes to the wrong country, will happen. Doesn't matter if we have a single DRS system, it's not an issue. But under the current proposals, it is an issue. It's excessive additional cost, and one which I believe will result in the administrations getting together to amend the proposals before they're implemented. And to me, having a 2.5-year lead time is quite telling. And I think the government are, frankly, I think they're expanding the timeline to allow time for more conversation and more innovation, one of which is a digital DRS. So if we had a digital DRS, that would work by the householder scanning a barcode with a smartphone. We wouldn't have to have all these take back points. You could use the existing curbside collection infrastructure that we have to collect it. We think it's a much more efficient way to do it. It's not been tested fully yet. There has been a trial, an ongoing trial in Wales, where the initial results are good. Is it to the point where it's good enough to form policy? Probably not, but it's also not far off. So the government have published their proposals for DRS, but I think there is more of the story to come.
Governor, do you have a supplemental? Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah.
This is the one that is going to challenge. There's 11 district and county operations collecting waste and processing it. Why aren't we unifying the entire system? What's your feedback from districts? Why they're so reluctant to actually unify the system and have one more efficient, one unified type of collections and product?
Again, through you, Chair. Really good question. Probably the most common question I get when I come to forums like this. No, that's okay. No, at the risk of being slightly flippant, it's a member issue. It's not an officer issue. The view on having a joined up single delivery body, if I can phrase it like that, is not one that is uniformly supported across the county. And until we get to that point, we have to do the best that we can within the existing two-tier structure. The thing I would point to currently is that there is a study that has been sponsored by the Hearts Leaders Group. That's due to start reporting, at least in draft form, in February, with a view to a final report going to the leaders in early March. And one of the questions I would anticipate that report tackling is that very question. We last looked at this in depth about 11 years ago. In theory, then there were lots of savings to be had by unifying it, but we've been through austerity since then. And year after year, you are driving out further efficiencies. But it is a question for the membership. It's not a question for the officers that deliver the daily service. That's where I don't want to use the word problem, but that's where it gets stuck in discussion, because it's not a view that's universally held.
Councillor McAndrew.
The potential for savings, if it was a sort of unified collection waste authority, would be vast, wouldn't it, Duncan?
In theory,
Resources, procurement.
absolutely. In theory, if you think about all the things that could get lined up, I mean, personally, would you have one collection operation for the entire county? Too big. You probably have 2 or 3 in 2-3 areas. There would be a lots of potential for rationalizing the back office. That said, these days it's hard to find an officer that works solely on waste. They tend to have lots of other duties and hats, so it's not as easy as it was. Would it make it more efficient? Yes, it probably would. But again, it requires the lead from the partner authorities themselves before we can make any real progress on it. And until we do, we continue to work as hard as we can within the existing setup.
I was just going to say it's good to see that East and North Arts are leading the way in the county of Hertfordshire.
Yes, about Master. Do you have?
Thank you. Probably a lot of what I know is actually learned from Duncan, so I just wanted to say that first. But yeah, he's absolutely right. There are some districts and boroughs who are philosophically against even outsourcing, so that's one of the stumbling blocks. But there are various consortia. So in terms of where the dry recycling goes, textiles. So the report that Duncan was talking about is really looking at the current state of play and then looking for any more opportunities that might be derived, which may be a long way short of having a unified service. But, you know, if there are ways that we can get people who are even potentially using the same service provider but aren't working together, and that is the case currently, that maybe we can move forward in a way that has clusters of local authorities at least that are working together.
Thank you. Councillor Huggins. I think we'll probably.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Firstly, I don't think Councillor Crofton's first question was answered, because the question was not why are we heading towards 2 separate services, but why are residents being asked to separate, or they cannot put food into the green waste, which is it is a common question which we get all the time. But secondly, on the councils that are not willing to join and have a joint service, would it be fair to say that that comes by the difference between rural and urban councils, which clearly have a very different cost of collection?
So you guys, on the first question, if I can try and answer that one again. We know from both our experience in Hertfordshire and across the country and through the professional associations, food waste, when you collect food waste with garden waste that goes for investable composting, you tend to capture a much lower level of food waste. There's nothing, because typically garden waste, in that scenario, the organics is typically collected once a fortnight. And we know that typically people don't like to have food waste hanging around either in a kitchen caddy or in an outside caddy for more than a couple of days. We also know that the tonnage that we then capture through separate weekly food waste collections tends to be significantly higher, which is the model that's been adopted. When you separate out the food waste. You then have the option, which most local authorities across the country will then take, of sending garden waste to what we call a windrow facility, very cheap composting process that legally cannot accept any food waste. Food waste can only go to either an universal composting facility of the sort that we've typically used historically, or it can go to food waste can go ideally to an anaerobic digestion plant. One thing to point out with the strategy is that it fundamentally is undermining the future of universal composting. If you read the strategy and you look at the food waste commitments, there is no future for IVC in this country. And you will find that most IVC providers are now gearing up to either leave the sector or, using the land that they have, consider their options around providing either open windrowing for just garden waste or investing in AD technology to provide a solution for food waste. But options for a combined food waste garden collection, I believe, are rapidly diminishing because they're simply not supported by government strategy anymore. On the second question about, is it an urban rural divide about who wants to join up, who doesn't, because of the comparative collection costs, it's not my experience that that's the issue. It's a much more fundamental issue, as Councillor Buckmaster has indicated. It comes down to the disposition of the authority and the belief in how local services should be provided. And you have two basic camps. You have those that like to cooperate and collaborate, as you do in East Herts and North Herts, and you have those authorities that believe that they're better placed to make those decisions locally. But I've never detected a rural-urban split in that discussion.
McAndrew, I think we'll try and make this the last question if we can.
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
was just going to sort of, in response to the question, there's numerous factors that some councils have in-house operations and others like us, it's sort of external. And some districts and boroughs, no matter what, they won't sort of join any other group or whatever. It's personal to them that they will do it, but they can't see further than the savings and that it will actually apply. But I think moving forward over the years, with the council's balance sheets being stretched, that it will happen, it will evolve over a period of time, but how long it takes is, you know, but yeah.
And did you say that there was a sort of something going to the various leaders sort of in the March time subject?
Yes, Chair. So the current, in essence, the current next steps are a finalised report to the Chief Execs Group by the end of February, assuming that gets signed off, and there'll be interim drafts prior to that so they can check progress and make sure it's going to say, well, it's met the brief. The intention is to send that at the moment to the Hearts Leaders Group on the 2nd of March, because they then meet on the 9th of March. Timescales after that are subject to how that group then wants to take any further work forward. But we are on, the officers are on the hook to get this done in effect by the end of February.
Thank you. Thank you.
An observation. Are we supposed to comment on this particular presentation, or are we asking officers to take this back to the exec with the, I don't know if it's a majority view or not, whether or not that's something we should encourage as a unified collection system.
Well, the presentation is under the heading of training, so it's really an informative presentation for us as a group. We're receiving the presentation, but certainly I think we would be, I don't know whether Councillor McAndrew is uniquely positioned to advise us on that.
Maybe Jess wants to sort of say something, but officers are actually looking at what's just come out from the government, and they will put something together for the exec on the way forward, similar to what Duncan's done this evening. There's quite a lot of documents there that they've got to read and find out the fine detail of. Yeah.
Jess, did you want to mention anything?
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff we've already forecasted. So certainly AFM, that's something we took out of our budget a good couple of years ago. Garden waste is obviously still questionable. So gross income for garden waste is about 1.5 million, net of about 600,000. So that's significant. So that's obviously on Stephen's radar. That disappears. You might remember we took a report to exec on the 25th of October. So Chloe presented a report about the new contract, and we've tried to anticipate some of those changes as part of our new contract. So all of that is in the mix. So, you know, weekly food collection, we've budgeted for that. So a lot of this stuff is in the mix, but I think as we go through the procurement process, we're doing a competitive dialogue, we'll be able to tweak some of those things as we learn more about the government strategy. But we've had these conversations for a long time, so I think a lot of that anticipated change is in the mix already.
With regard to the sort of county-wide scheme for waste, there's sort of an initiative that's being brought forward to the leadership group, and that Councillor McAndrews has mentioned that something may go to executives about on the back of that. Is there something you wanted to speak about specifically about that?
So I think, yeah, I mean, scrutiny, whether that's this group or overview and scrutiny, are obviously more than welcome to put that on the forward plan for something to be shared. But I think initially we'll need to get a steer from the leaders and the chief execs and how that works. But like I said, I think we've approached this subject before, and ultimately as an isolated district, there's only so much influence you can have. It needs to be the collective, and like Duncan and colleagues have mentioned, that seems to be the challenge. So from an ESART's perspective, as officers, you know, we've provided as much information as required to support that strategy and that report moving forward.
Thank you. Councillor Target, yeah, final point. Thank
you. Yeah, I was just wondering whether, because I can't remember the detail without seeing it, if this the volatility of waste features in our risk management under a financial heading, and whether or not we could include it if it isn't the next time that the risk comes around.
Volatility, you mean? I'm not quite sure you remember what
well,
part of
we've just heard that we could have reduced income from waste. There's also yeah, so it's whether or not there's a financial hit that needs to be picked up within our risk management under a financial heading, I would suspect.
Jess, you mentioned that we've tried to anticipate sort of things that are on the horizon. Things like major reduction in income because of the deposit to return scheme. Has that been factored into the medium-term financial plan?
So in terms of our strategic risk register, financials are on there. So like I say, Stephen's well informed by our service manager. And in addition to that, in the strategic risk register, we've got performance of the contractors as well. So obviously we've got a materials processing contractor. We're just in discussions around actually what does the future of that look like in terms of extension, possibly aligning with the Hearts Waste partnership. So they are on the radar. Granted, we might need to evolve how we do the updates on that, given the more detailed information that we've got coming forward.
Can I just check with the point that Councillor Huggins made, which I think is a good one, will that be reflected in the minutes? So we'll make sure that's in the minutes. Your point. Yeah. Yeah. Are we due, Stephen, are we due to see the risk register next meeting? That's due to come to our next meeting, the risk register. So we can do that then, maybe. Okay, Duncan, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. Thank you. You're very welcome to leave if you, or you, alternatively, you can stay for a very kind of riveting meeting. Okay, thank you. So we're up to item 6 now, which is the 2023-24 budget and medium-term financial plan. Councillor Williamson, I believe you're going to introduce this. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Chairman.
Councillor Mark-Foster, thank you.
Good evening, everybody. So the committee's already seen an early iteration of the budget for 23-24, the MTFP from 2023. That was back in November. At that time, the budget was based on a number of different assumptions. And one of the assumptions we based the budget on was that council tax would be applied at a maximum of £5, which is what the limit has been for this council for a number of years. We had the Chancellor's autumn statements, and well, at the meeting we knew there were rumours that possibly the council tax limits could change, and indeed that did come through with the Chancellor's autumn statement, where we are now allowed to technically increase up to the higher of £5 or 2.99%, and for us the 2.99% is the higher. So the impact of that is that we can actually increase council tax not by £5 but £5.50 which translates only to a penny a week in terms of council tax bills, but does actually bring in an extra £33,000 worth of income, which is going to be most welcome. So we've applied the maximum council tax increase that we've been allowed to apply for the last 4 or 5 years, and so we are recommending we stick to that strategy, and by now going to the £5.50. Since the November meeting, of course, we've also had the provisional statement in provisional settlement just before Christmas, and so Stephen has adjusted the numbers throughout the reports accordingly for whether things have moved up or down compared to any earlier assumptions. But having said all that, the sort of overall net cost of services has not changed significantly, and neither has the savings target that we have for 23-24. Not significantly. We had 812,000 in the November report. It's moved up slightly to 822,000. So that was the challenge we had, to try and meet the budget gap for 23-24. We tasked the leadership team to look for whatever savings could still be made from operations, delivery of services, but really for internal streamlining, efficiencies and so forth, that would not affect the delivery as far as residents of East Herts are concerned. And through some extremely diligent work by the leadership team, actually produced a set of savings which are listed in the report of 866,000. So the headline there is actually the savings target we're looking at for 23-24 has already been achieved, in fact overachieved. Part of the savings, however, that have been part of our plans for the last 2-3 years did involve steadily reducing the amount of money we're giving out as community grants. We're recommending we continue with that policy, mainly because, in fact, there are other ways that we can help local communities generate funds, and not least, of course, with the UK's Shared Prosperity Fund, which we've been awarded, which is about 1.2 million, I think, isn't it, over 3 years. So there are lots of other ways we can help local communities get funding or provide funding, but without using that community grants budget. So, and the other thing, sorry, which again we agreed previously in previous budgets to be phased in over a couple of years, is to slightly reduce the amount of support we give to the CAB. It was £152,000 a year. We've reduced it to 139, and we're further recommending we reduce it by another 10,000 to 129 from next year. But it's still considerably more than many other local authorities give to the CAB. All those taken together actually provide overall savings of 930,000. So only 822 needed to fund the budget gap. But we still think that extra 108,000, given that we still have about 6.7 million to save from 2024 onwards, is still worth pursuing and should be put sort of in the bank, if you like, to help us with those future years. Going through some of the other recommendations in the reports, just to mention, say we have some pretty hefty numbers we need to look at from 24-25 onwards. Therefore, to try and smooth over and lessen the impact on the MTFP, whilst the use of reserves should always be considered extremely cautiously, we do feel that it's appropriate to call on our reserves on a temporary basis to help the smoothing effect. If we didn't use the reserves, the savings we would need to find over those years would be even higher. The report does describe how we'd use those reserves, which reserves would be involved, and the timescale for, if you like, paying ourselves back in over the longer term. The other thing to mention is our capital program. As you will be aware, with our capital program, we now have to allow for the minimum revenue provision, which has an impact on the MTFP. So we've looked at the capital program and looked at those items which are, let's say, less essential or non-essential that can be deferred. And by doing so, we can then take out of the MTFP the minimum revenue provision that that would go along with that part of the program, which again is effectively giving us further savings over the period. So you'll notice in the capital program there are various items that have been moved into a section called I think it's approved but not allocated, or words to that effect. Thank you. Approved but not committed, which means they can be pulled back into the main program at any time if the funding is made available. But for the moment, we've put them into that section so that to be considered at a future time. That's basically it, Chairman. But lots more detail in the report, of course. But happy to take any questions.
Councillor Williams, thank you very much indeed. Are there any? Councillor Huggins.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to ask first about the in paragraph 1.3. There's an assumption of 10% in growth of local council tax support cases. Could you comment on how that 10% has been reached? Because whilst we've decided to put council tax up by the maximum again, I think we need to be concerned with those that are struggling with the cost of living crisis. So could we just have a comment about how that 10% has been calculated?
I believe this has been with conversations with the head of revenues benefit service. That's her experience and her predictions.
Huggins, you want to? Thank you.
Could the cut in funding for the Citizens Advice Bureau not be considered a little bit short term in thinking? Because I think it's, although on paper it could save us 10,000, I think, was it £10,000 a year? Could that not then end up in resulting in more costs for the council elsewhere, where the council has to pick up issues that the Citizens Advice then can't deal with because of the loss of income? And possibly even end up dealing with those issues when they get further along the sort of severity scale, and end up with even more increased costs at that point too.
We've considered in the past. We are conscious that the CAB has taken some cost out of its own operations and don't have any face-to-face facilities now. It's all done online or on telephone. So, they don't need as much support from us as they have as we've been able to give them in the past. So really the proposed reduction is in line, if you like, with the savings they are making within their own operations.
But then but obviously the population of East Herts is constantly growing, not reducing, and with the cost of living crisis happening at the moment, surely there's a likelihood that more people want to use the Citizens Advice Bureau over the next couple of years than might have previously when financial situations weren't as difficult as well.
Yes, thank you. But Chair, we don't believe that necessarily going to add to their operational cost. So I think that the stance we've taken that by no longer having the face-to-face functionality, which used to be provided from here, of course, sorry, sorry, because they're no longer providing that face-to-face service and operational costs have gone down, even though they may have more calls upon their services. I think the reduction in funding we're providing is still in line with the savings in their own operational costs. So I think that's still reasonable.
we've also given them some sort of help and guidance in making grant applications to raise funds to replace the funds that we've been providing them in the past. Is that right, Stephen?
Excuse me, Chairman. Yes, as part of this year, we have actually provided grant support to assist with bid writing, and we're doing that via the Council of Voluntary Services. And part of that as well, and not to forget, members not to forget that the social value policy was agreed. So that actually has particular, it's called a TOM, it's a theme, outcome and measure. So a lot of those in relation to the larger procurements will seek to leverage in further funding and advantage into the third sector. And the other thing I'd say in relation to grants that we give, we're giving a general grant to the CAB, and therefore that is going into paying officers like the Chief Executive and permanent members of staff. Other local authorities use a service level agreement model. At my previous council, we were paying a general grant, and we stopped paying a general grant to the CAB. And we started going down service level agreement, particular targeted interventions around homelessness and debt management. And the CAB just continued. It's one of those things where it's a general grant, it's generally going on their overheads and stuff like that. Rather, so we're just reducing. They'll have to reduce their overheads basically to compensate for it. So we're not cutting specific targeted SLA payments because we don't really use them, and we should be using them, because then you're getting an agreed service for the money that you're paying. At the moment, you're just handing money over to the CAB and they can do what they like with it. So I think it's an important distinction that we need to move them onto that SLA model as well. So rather than just seeing it as because the volunteers, generally speaking, they can have the support, but they're not paid. And therefore, the CAB absolutely does rely on its volunteers. And hopefully with the money that is coming through on the Shared Prosperity Fund, money that will leverage in over the long term with the social value policy, and by moving to an SLA model, we'll get better value for money, I believe, out of those grants.
Thank you. That's useful. Thank you. These two items on the in the budget with regard to the CVS funding and also the citizen advice, but these are member decisions. Will these be sort of considered by members when the budget is put to council? Is that the forum where members will consider that?
Members have every opportunity of raising this at council.
Sorry.
Members, of course, have every opportunity of raising this when we present the budget to council next March.
Yeah, I just wondered, is that when? Because these two are earmarked as being for member decision. I just wondered at what point members will decide make the decision.
Well, it will be at the full council
Full
meeting.
fine.
Yes, I mean that's just a differentiation between all the other savings which I mentioned, which are going to be purely officer led.
Thank you. Sorry, Councillor Warbird, you wanted to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean we've covered these arguments over the CAB grant in quite a lot of detail before. A point that was previously raised that I'll just repeat. You know, the last set of published accounts that they have, they made a surplus of £54,000. So we need to look at the grants we make in the round. I think the point about a service level agreement model that Stephen made is very valid. We are the only local authority, I think, that operates this model. And actually, we should be using the grant money that we do give the CAB tailored towards helping with the services that the council does provide to help what the council does. So we've had these arguments before, and I'm more than content with the proposed draft proposals in the executive budget.
That's Crofton.
I'm more than happy with the reduction in the CAB on the basis of their accounts stack up, and they are a voluntary organisation and they've taken steps to minimise their overhead. So, but I'm actually would challenge you to actually take it a lot further. I don't think they need the money at this sort of level, and I'd actually hold that back in reserves and perhaps even advise them over the next few years that you're scaling it back to a token sum over a period of 2 or 3 years, because if they can plan for that, and it's based on the fact that our accounts, until our accounts recover and our income recovers substantially, we're not going to have money to be so lavish that we perhaps once were. My other point is on 1.3 that Councillor Huggins mentioned, we're talking about 10% growth on for new build. I don't know if you're aware, but I'm fairly close to the construction industry, and I know several large house building companies that are making redundancies. There's one particular Midlands company that hasn't sold a new house in the last 6 weeks. So this new sales has fallen off a cliff, and it might and it will change, but we don't know when. It'll all be based on when interest rates get back to a sensible level. So I would be very, very cautious on hanging your hat on a 10% growth indefinitely, because it might not happen for a while.
Thank you, Councillor Crofton. I think the 10% figure actually relates to council tax support cases, as Councillor Huggins referred to earlier. Although we do mention we are expecting additional growth in new properties, which should be information coming through from our planning department, as well as Revs and Bens. Whatever our figures are based on, we have reasonable confidence that they will come through. Oh, yes, I think just been pointed out to me that the effect of the 2008 downturn in the construction industry didn't come through in terms of figures until 2010. So there is that slight lag. So perhaps we might see more of an effect in 2025.
Thank you. On page 29, the local government funding regime is mentioned, and the fact that it's unlikely that anything will happen before the general election. Do we have any idea when government may get around to mending this regime, or not? We don't have a clear sign of that yet, I suppose.
I think, Chairman, the general consensus is it's been in for the next Parliament. It's been put there. They're not going to take it forward. It will be for the next Parliament, and whoever the government is after the next general election, I suspect, that will deal with this. There's certainly, from what we can gather in Westminster and Whitehall, no appetite to tackle local government finance. Everybody knows council tax and business rates are broken, but nobody wants to deal with it in this Parliament. So it will be in the next Parliament where we'll see some movement on this, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Huggins.
Yeah, just a question for my own understanding. In Appendix A, which sets out the actual cost per service, they all rise, as you would expect over time, with the exception of the IT shared service. Presumably that therefore is a flat contract rate if it's not rising, if that's correct.
I may have to defer to Mr. Linnetz for this one. Thank you.
We hold a central provision for inflation on major contracts, and the IT shared services is a major contract. So therefore, inflation is held within a central provision, and we release that as and when the various indexes kick in for that. So you'll see that it's showing as across the piece there, because we have no indication yet what inflation will be for the IT shared service, because there's no actually agreed indexation of it. It tends to be when we and Stevenage find out about the pay increase, and it works its way through. So it's shown like that, but there is money within the contract inflation provision to meet inflation on that particular budget. But as I say, there's no agreed index point. There's no agreed index formula. It's very much once the pay effect comes through, because it's about 50% of the cost. We begin to understand that, and then the software companies seem to have their own strange policies as to when and where and how by how much. So we have to wait for that to feed through. It's not like with waste, where it's an agreed formula on an agreed date. Thank you. There is money for that, for the inflation on that, so which is held in the central provision.
Thank you.
Ask about the contract date on that. When is that shared service? Is that under a contract, or has that got a finish date?
Yes, I'm afraid off the top of my head I couldn't tell you what it is, though. I'm sorry. I've been told it's actually a rolling contract unless we give a year's notice. So thank you for the voice in my right ear.
Yeah, thank you. We're on page 35. We talk about additional rates retention from us. It refers to that. Could be we'll be a member of the Hertfordshire Pool in 22-23. I know that I think whether or not we're allowed to be a member of this group isn't necessarily within our control. Do you think there's a chance we may continue to be a member of that pool for more than one year?
Because there's been a revaluation, Chairman, I'm unclear at the moment whether there is a pool next year at all, because I think everybody's actually pulling out of it. Because I don't think with the way that the rates revaluation has come about, with the actual figures that are coming through. I mean, we're seeing some very wild and large movements in things like office accommodation and multi-storey car parks have shot up in value. Agricultural properties have shot up in value as well. So I don't think that with that level of volatility and expected appeals, which will undoubtedly come from this rating, and I have to say, having to produce an NNGR1 manually, it's the first time I've ever had to do an NNGR1 manually because of the IT outage affected our ability to upgrade our revenue systems, which are currently being upgraded now, but we can't run an NNGR1, so I've had to do that manually, and the amount of smoke and mirrors and grants and transitional reliefs and all the rest of it that have gone into the NNGR1 for this revaluation, I've never seen anything like it. You know, there is the old joke about amongst finance officers and revenue officers, you know, for 30 years, the government made one change to NNGR, and since it became a localized retained tax for local authorities, they've made something like 400. And it's very tortuous this year with the revaluation, with several different new reliefs coming through. And by the time you get to the end of it, you've taken out about £6 or £7 million of rate debit that is just relieved out of the system. So to try and limit the amount of increases that people will pay. So I don't think, I get the general impression from those who were supposed to be in the pool that the pool will not go ahead. And I think a number of pools will just disappear because of the sheer volatility of what this revaluation has done.
In Appendix A on page 48, you've got 511,000 worth of income or funding for 23-24 in the table there, but nothing in the following years, which is what you explained. But I just wanted to, I suppose as opposed to what you just said is the 511,000 there. Can we rely on that? And also, is there any possibility of us getting anything in subsequent years?
That 511 is our estimated gain on rates by being in the pool in 22-23.
So that will still happen. That will still.
That's what we're still estimating we will get from it. But
Yeah.
Because the way the system works, it'll be booked after year end in that year. So and then we can transfer it into 23-24 to utilize it. So we haven't budgeted for any income or any net gain on it because I don't think it's prudent to do that. I've always taken the view with rates pooling, and I was in one of the first rates pools, is that if you get anything, it's a windfall, and you use it the next year. I've known people take an assumption on rates pooling and getting very badly burnt on their budget by having it in. So you know, accountants are always saying it's imprudent to anticipate income. I'm totally on that, imprudent to do income, which is why it's starting to show like that, because it'll be booked in 22-23 once the NNGR3 signed off, etc. And we've had the cash from Deluxe, then it can be used to apply to assist with the 23-24 budget. But that's the current estimate that we've had, and that's supported by LG Futures analysis of where we currently are on rating.
Thank you. On page 43, there's a heading or the section about implications and consultations of sort of what's been happening, and it talks about consulting with business rate payers and also with the public. What do we know? Any idea what sort of form that will take?
With the public, we do the annual resident survey to find out how happy people are with our services, and I do recall that Ben Wood gave you some early indications of how satisfaction improved with refuse, recycling, even planning and parking. You know, the two more unpopular services for reasons best known to people as to why they're so unpopular. But it's shown a marked improvement in satisfaction with services compared to last year, and with business rate payers, we're always. I know that the meetings with the Bishop Stortford bid, for example, which were about direct debits and stuff like that, which we're actively working to get past IT to actually implement, etc. So we do get that feedback from businesses, and we do listen and take that into account, particularly around parking, season tickets, etc., etc. So we do listen to business rate payers, as well. I have to admit, but I say when the business ratepayers get their bills this year, it'll be, I suspect, to be pandemonium for a couple of weeks.
Thank you. In Appendix A, page 47, the amount of investment income sort of trending from 23-24 through to 27-28 kind of falls a bit. Is that because of interest rates going down?
It's a combination of interest rates expecting to go down and the amount of cash that's available being less because of the considerable amounts of capital expenditure in the capital programme over those years. So we're expecting the amount of cash that is available generally to go down, and interest rates to be falling in line with what the Treasury strategy predicts as interest rates falling back.
And lastly, Appendix B on page 51, which is the approved not committed capital projects. Elizabeth Road, is the amount that's kind of in there but not committed because it's possible that we may not go ahead with the improvements that might be made to that location?
As it stands at the moment, there is a planning application that's been submitted to the local planning authority. When we did Elizabeth Road, it made sense for us to do the redevelopment, as we would have effectively what was 2 large shop units, which could be divided into 5, and then 9 residential units, which were independent of the shops, to be either sold or let out, plus space for a detached townhouse. Now, the finances of us employing a contractor to do that don't work, or they certainly didn't work when we looked at it last. So what we said is we get planning permission on the site if possible, and then we would look to sell that, because we think a local builder can make a profit on that, and it would be desirable to them. And of course, with planning permission, it increases the land value.
And so we wouldn't need to spend the capital funding on improving the thing ourselves.
I mean, in terms of the existing building, we had looked to, we would have had permitted development rights as well, so we wouldn't have had to have submitted a planning application, but the foundations simply weren't strong enough from how it was built, because we wanted to go up on the existing building, obviously for the encapsulated carbon in it. The foundations we found by Strat survey were simply not strong enough, and underpinning them was not making economic sense, which is why the application included demolition and reprovision of the building.
Thank you very much. Okay, members, I don't know if there are no further questions, we can go back to page 26. Now, there are a number of items here that we are looking at, but they're all for noting. I mean, our eye is to agree any recommendations to the executive arising from this stuff. I mean, I don't think we've got any recommendations to make. I think we were happy broadly with the figures and the sentiment of the report, and so I think we're just noting this. If that's H. So we're noting A through H with no recommendations to be made. Are we happy with that? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we now go on to item 7. It came on the supplemental agenda, and this is the investment strategy. Councillor Williamson, is that I was going to hand on? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. CIPFA revised the Treasury Management Code of Practice and the Prudential Code in 2001, and this is the first year in which that revised code has come into force. Members will note that there is a new liability benchmark Treasury indicator, which supports the financing risk of the capital financing requirement, and is to be shown in chart form, and members will see that in the report. Where that liability benchmark should be is showing in the correct position. So it's a negative figure effectively in each of the 3 years, and we have to project that forward 50 years in order to come to that. Long-term Treasury investments, including pooled funds, must be classified as commercial investments unless justified by a cash flow business case. This is all part of the code's requirement that we don't hold long-term investments, and that we should liquidate them, and instead of paying for borrowing, which has been quite controversial between CIPFA and local government finance section 151 officers, but there is that there. Pool funds to be included in the indicator of principal sums maturing in years beyond the initial budget year. This is pool funds like money market funds and property investment vehicles. Amendment to the knowledge and skills register for officers and members involved in the Treasury management function, and to be proportionate in size of the complexity in the Treasury management conducted by each authority. So the more complex it is, the more rigorous will be the requirement on the training for both officers and members. And I think that's partially a response to what's happened in Thurrock, where I think officers went off and some members went off and
mean for us as members of this committee, I should say, in terms of training?
In relation to what our treasury management operations will be, Chairman, there will be it will be small, it'll be cash flow management in the main. And it will be managing the borrowing and getting that borrowing down. So we'll plan to schedule borrowing so that once interest rates have come down, we'll lock in those lower interest rates, and that debt will be paid off each year. So as MRP is applied, we will pay that debt off. So you see the amount of debt that's there coming down, and also the amount of interest that we're paying coming down. And we'll also reach the point then when it'll be safe enough to reactivate capital expenditure, because we'll have that borrowing headroom coming back as we follow that down. There's a tendency sometimes in local authorities to say MRPs for 30 years, so we'll take the debt for 30 years. I don't think that's the right thing to do, because I think it's important to get your debt levels down, your interest payment levels down. The MRP is the MRP because it's going to be the same amount for 30 years. That's what our policy says. So for me, it's important to get that debt down to build that headroom so that members can make capital expenditure choices, but also get those revenue costs down from avoiding the interest.
So in terms of borrowing, are you still using short-term borrowing?
We are still using short-term money market borrowing, and in fact, because there was not an interest rate rise from the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, quite literally 2 days before we were due to take the borrowing, the borrowing rate that we were actually charged for that short-term borrowing came down. So it's that sensitive at the moment to the money market. And of course, we haven't yet seen that large drop in government gilt yields yet. And of course, PWB rate is linked to the government gilt yield, not to the Bank of England base rate. So the Bank of England base rate is neither here nor it only matters for us in terms of taking short-term borrowing at average SONIA rates, which is the sterling overnight index average, which replaced LIBOR. But yes, the Bank of England base rate and the amount that we're paying in debt, because we take our debt from the government's debt management office, and that's government gilt. So the 4% yield that it's still at 4%. So it hasn't come down yet, but the Treasury advisor's view is that it will come down over the next year or so.
Councillor Walworth, I know you want to come in on this, but just one more question. Do you think we will be taking out any more long-term borrowing in the nearish future, or will we continue to use the short-term options for what we need to borrow?
When the rates are right, we will lock it in with the PWB at long-term rates. So some of the debt will be short-term, some of it will be long-term, because that's we will take debt that we can pay off in chunks as the MRP is applied. So from the last projections that I did, we'll have 2.2 million of loans for the next 30 years. So each year we'll have 2.2 million, and that will repay during each of those years. So at the end of it, it'll all have been paid off. But it'll work with the MRP to come down on a rolling basis, rather than ballooning it all out at 30 years.
Oh, sorry.
It was just very quickly in terms of the sort of short-term borrowing. What sort of terms is that short-term borrowing? Is it overnight or 30 days, 90 days? What sort of terms are we?
It's any period up to and including 364 days.
Okay.
So we're tending at the moment to be about the 6-month mark. It's those who have cash and want to lend.
And are we borrowing from other local authorities or just on the money market?
It's through the term deposit market. I could not tell you exactly off the top of my head who it's with, but I can take a look if you're interested.
On page 20, you talk about the Treasury Management Consultants link, and we spoke last time about the possibility of considering reviewing whether you want to continue with them. Is that something you're still thinking you might do at some point in the future?
Chairman, I believe the contract is up in the next year or so. So we will go through a process of looking at that, and we will go out to competitive tender. Basically, it is between Link and Arling Close Limited for Treasury advice to local authorities. From what I can gather, Link Group, their parent company, would rather like to sell them, but nobody's buying. And they're becoming rather, how should I put this? If you ask them anything, they want to know how much you're paying before they'll answer it. So what we think should be included within the fee we're paying, they're saying, well, that's consultancy, that's extra. So I have my own views on links, which I won't share with the committee. So
thank you. On page 23, there was a table at the top of the page, external borrowings, a line called regeneration. I wonder if you could just tell us explain what that line refers to.
Within the revised code, it says that you should be, service spend is one thing, but then you also have housing, urban regeneration and renewal. So that's urban regeneration and renewal. So that's when you've done land assembly. In my opinion, Old River Lane fits into that category for discipline. So it's that sort of thing. There, does that answer you?
Yeah. On page 25, there's a portfolio position table with religious figures in the bottom total external borrowing line. Would we have any investments in that table?
Chairman, I apologise to the committee, but I had a lot of staff shortages, and staff sickness. So I was doing this table and I just didn't have time to complete this. So it will be completed in time for executive to recommend to council. So yes, the investments will be in there as well as all the borrowing as we anticipate it.
Thank you. I think that's what. If there are any other points? No. Okay, in which case we need to go back to the recommendation on page 3, which is that we review and comment on the Treasury Management and Annual Investment Strategy 2024. Well, I think we've reviewed it. We've got the comments, have we? So we're just happy to we've reviewed it. Councillor Huggins, I think it was a proposal. Thank you. That's the Fernando. Thank you. It's a second. All those in favour? Thank you. That's part of the carry. Thank you. That's item 7. Item 8, capital strategy and minimum revenue provision policy. Councillor Williamson, I think you're on.
Okay, thank you. Well, as the committee knows, the need to have an annual capital strategy was introduced following strengthening of guidance from SIPFA and the government a few years ago. So this is the 5th iteration of our capital strategy. It's a very valuable document and it does guide us through our sort of capital program and use of capital in delivering our projects. Other than that, the details in the report, happy to take, or Stephen and I are happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Any questions? On page 54, it talks about the part of the condition survey of Warfields, and I think you mentioned it before, Stephen, about the boiler might need repairing. Is that, I mean, that sounds expensive. Is that been allowed for anywhere in any budget?
Yes, Chairman, it's allowed for in the capital programme because there's 250,000 in the next year and the year after that, which is to bring building up to standard. I mean, the boiler will have to be done. It's originally there was 2 boilers there. There's now only 1 boiler. It's on its last legs. You know, it's open to prayer. So whether we stay or whether we go, the building will require a boiler installation.
And then you obviously go on to mention about the public sector decarbonisation scheme, but that's kind of a match funding arrangement, I believe, isn't it?
It's an arrangement where you would pay what you would pay to do a non-decarbonised. So if you were replacing the heating system, you'd pay what you would pay for a commercial gas boiler, but then you get additional money on top, which allows you to decarbonise. So again, that we have consultants who can do a decarbonised scheme, and they do that on the basis of no win, no fee. But if we are thinking of going and leaving the building, it would seem rather disingenuous to ask them to work that up on a no win no fee basis and then us just go. So we're a little reluctant to actually ask the consultants to do that final piece of work until we have clarity about whether we're going or staying.
Thank you. I must say this paper is incredibly well written, I thought, and informative. I mean, it must have taken a while to produce. And
we'll need something to do at 3 AM, Chairman.
Oh, but yeah. But there's so much. It seems to be that you're having to do more and more. Do you find you're having to do more and more stuff?
It grows every year, Chairman. The sheer amount of information that needs to go into these things to satisfy the codes of practice, and also the curiosity that members have at this council to, they're asking the right questions and wanting to know the right piece of information. It does grow. I mean, it is possible to do these things incredibly boilerplate and incredibly, with the minimum amount possible, but members ask questions, and I think it's important that if members want that information, we provide that information.
I just thought this report in particular just contained an awful lot of information. It was a wide-ranging information too.
I think that reflects the ambition of members and the ambition of the council, particularly around its capital programme. So I think it reflects where we are as a council.
The risk sort of section of this report, which kind of starts on page 92 of the pack, it's page 35, I think, of the report. Have we seen this? Maybe I shouldn't be asking that question, probably, but
You find it surprisingly in last year's,
Yeah,
the year
yeah.
before that, and the year before that.
well, it's interesting on the top on page 92. It talks about the council's risk management strategy was last reviewed in spring 2019.
And that should have been it was.
Okay, but then it goes on to say it's reviewed annually. So
that should that should be 2022.
20,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I didn't remember seeing it, did I, last time? So I can't tell. In terms of the scoring, how this is looked at, who kind of determines what the scoring is? Is that the same sort of and could you just in terms of how the scoring, the numbers come up, is it time to multiplying two numbers? I couldn't quite work it out. Maybe I should have worked it out. I couldn't quite work it out. For instance, on page 98, change in local government structure, it's got a residual score of 6.
Because it's 4 and 4. If it's the top risk, it'll be 8. So because you've got 4 of likelihood and 4 of impact, depending on what it scores. So the 8 would be the
worst.
The worst, yeah. So I think that's right.
Six is getting there, then, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's 4 is probable and 4 is very high risk. So that would be a total score of 8. So
fine. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah. And so this is looked at annually. Yeah. Okay. I think other than the other points. Very good bit of work. Here we go. I don't know if there are any other questions. I mean, thank you for the report. So go back to the recommendations, page 52. We are endorsing the executive's draft capital strategy minimum revenue provision 2024, and endorsing the principle of selling assets to raise capital receipts to reduce the revenue costs of the capital program. And Elizabeth Road one we talked about earlier, it is a case in point, isn't it? If we were able to sell that, if that was to be sold, then the proceeds would be used for that very purpose, wouldn't it?
yes, Chairman. That's what capital receipts can only be used to repay debt, or
so could they not be used to save borrowing?
They can be used to repay debt, or they can be used to finance capital expenditure, effectively to avoid debt.
To avoid debt, yes.
So that the principal aim of the capital receipts policy is to avoid interest and MRP payments, because prices have risen quite substantially, particularly for construction. So what a project that was, we're seeing really substantial cost increases, for example, at Hertford Theatre, and potentially coming through at Old River Lane as well. So it is real inflation, and we're not going to have a period of deflation as far as we can tell. So those higher prices are sort of like here to stay now. That's the new normal. So anything that avoids borrowing obviously reduces revenue costs in the long term. I mean, we do have, it's probably better to discuss it in the strategic asset management plan, but we have assets that are surplus that could be sold worth 2.4 million in the balance sheet. So,
and this is internal borrowing rather than external borrowing.
Well, whether it's internal or external borrowing, now we've got a positive CFR.
Yeah,
you're supposed to make minimum revenue provision on internal borrowing once you go over that CFR provision. So it's avoiding any borrowing at all that helps reduce your revenue costs.
Thank you. Apologies. So page 52, there's 2 recommendations. We're happy to. Councillor Fernando was a positive. Councillor Bell was a seconder. All those in favour? Thank you. That's item 8. We're done. Item 9, draft strategic asset management plan. Councillor Williamson.
Thank you. I was actually going to point out that the second recommendation on the previous paper does link into the strategic asset management plan. So there are some quite close links there. So yes, this paper presents a refresh of our asset management plan for the next 5 years, works alongside the capital strategy. What we're really looking to do here is ensure that all our property assets, of which the total value comes to 120 million, are basically performing to their optimum, whether property we're talking about as our own offices or operational bases such as Buntingford, or property we might own as financial investments. Got a wide range of property assets which are often legacy, general legacies, either from when we transferred our housing stock or even those who may have inherited from our pre-1974 predecessors. So what the plan is looking to do is to evaluate how each of these assets contribute to our corporate priorities and whether the best course of action with each is retention, further investment, or conversely, whether it's in our best interest to look at disposal. And this is perhaps where it links into the previous paper. Got a case in point, shop in Bullfields in Sawbridgeworth, not returning particularly good yield. We've had the opportunity of selling it to the tenant, and that's producing a capital receipt, which actually, as Stephen has explained, therefore reduces our borrowing requirements, and therefore the MRP we have to allow for it. So it's actually in the council's interest on that kind of situation to look at disposal of property if it's not producing very much for us. In the appendix, there is a full list of all those property assets with the valuation on each one. And for those that we do get some income, maybe a commercial property or investment property, it's showing the amount, the gross amount we're getting in, so we can calculate what the yield is. So yes, quite a lot of useful detail there. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. On page 132, which talks about the usable reserves, and then you're quoting a figure of 26.5 million as at March 22. Is that both general and earmark reserves? And has that figure changed much since then? And that's quite an old number. Is that? Would we have a more recent number? Well, I just wonder why we did March 22.
Chairman, I'm waiting. I was going to have a word with you, Chairman, about we may well need a statement of accounts approval subcommittee in February to approve the 2021 accounts.
At some point,
it's the situation as at the 31st of March 2022. Now, we don't tend to make reserve movements in year of a dramatic nature. They tend to be year-end entries. So that's why it's quoting the 22 figure. If anything, our usable reserves will come down during this period as we have some planned usage, particularly around the national non-domestic rate deficit, which we had Section 31 grant to place into earmarked reserves. So some of the earmarked reserves will come down as a result of that. But I mean, generally speaking, we've had some new homes bonus go in as well. So it tends to be around the 26 million mark. But of course, that's not all free cash. That's some of that is held there as for insurance purposes. It's also held there for unforeseen events, emergencies, etc. Before what's called the Bellwyn scheme will kick in an emergency. And there's also specific funding there which can only be used, for example, for individual electoral registration, where that grant's being placed in reserves. There's homelessness grant which is being placed in reserves, which can only be spent on homelessness. So they are revenue reserves that are available, but it's not all free cash. Some of it has strings attached to it.
Some of the references to using reserves in maybe in the earlier papers, or maybe even some of the ones maybe to come, talk about using the general reserve for various things. Are we putting that under a bit of pressure in terms of sort of using it to prop up various things?
Well, I mean, that's what the purpose of the general reserve is. So, I mean, East Herts is slightly unusual in having the general fund, which seems to be kept at a very low minimum balance sort of level, and then the general reserve, which is basically its general fund, but called a general reserve. So it's a very unusual way of doing it. Just generally speaking, it's the general fund. But for some reason, East Herts historically has moved it out of the general fund and put it into an earmarked reserve called the general reserve. So not quite sure why, but it's been done historically. But basically the two of them added together are the general fund, so.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, Councillor Huggins, sorry.
Yeah, if I could ask about paragraph 5.4, I think it's on page 136. Parks and open spaces, one of my bugbears being a rural member. It quite clearly paints the picture of the inequality that people that live in the rural areas are paying for the upkeep of urban parks and open spaces. And as we saw in the detail of the budget going forward, there's £50,000 a year going in there for the replacement of play equipment. This clearly identifies there's an inequality. It gives 3 methods of addressing that at the end, but doesn't really give a clear steer as to what our plan is going forward, other than we've got three methods of addressing it.
Yes, Councillor Huggins, now that we've identified double taxation, we need to assess what the amount of double taxation is, and then a paper will be brought to members, and it is a member decision whether they wish to pursue a special expense, whether they wish to tolerate the double taxation, or whether they wish to do some sort of asset transfer deal to make the double taxation come away. It's not for officers to make a recommendation on this. It is down to members. It's a member decision. And as I think you can see from the example in there, just £100,000 on Hertford alone, because of the council tax base and the way it operates, will result in a £20 charge to council tax as a special expense for that sort of expenditure. So you can have very small rural parishes which, effectively the special expense could be double what their parish council tax is, depending on how you do this. So it's for members to make that considered decision once officers have presented them with the figures, etc. And it may be, I mean, at previous council, it was decided to tolerate it rather than to tackle it because of the huge amounts it would cause on council tax bills. A neighbouring district council did a major transfer of all of its parks and open spaces and playgrounds, etc., but did that with a cash bounty to each town and parish council to take it on, so that they had money for maintenance. I don't think we're in the position of being able to be so generous if we were to do asset transfers, etc. So it's for members to decide. It's not for officers to. It's for officers to offer you the options, but it is an emotive issue, I'm aware, and the decision can have quite substantial taxation increases locally as a result of if you do go down the special expense line.
Thank you.
No, I mean, I don't have a supplementary question. I have my own views on what we should be doing and where, and of course we have got some parks and open spaces which are strategically important to the council, which should obviously be protected, but then others should not. But no further question.
Thank you. I think just one last point, actually, the strategic asset management plan actually contains the income that we receive from the companies, from the councils, I should say, property assets that aren't included within Millstream, I think. So if we wanted to look to see how they're performing, I think that information is included in this report.
Where any asset produces income either from lease or from car park charges, for example, I've put that income into the list in the column just before the valuation.
Yeah, so it's interesting if people wanted to look. The information is contained in this report. Thank you. Okay. So in which case then we go back to page 113. There are 2 recommendations, and yes, and it's there are 2 recommendations as an either or. So either but I don't think we really made any observations, do I think we were happy with the report. So I would suggest that we will go for recommendation A, where we're endorsing the executive strategy. Got a proposer, Alistair Booth, Councillor Fernandez, a second.
Did my comments about park and open spaces not count as an observation?
Well, maybe it should do, and maybe it should.
Chairman, I'm happy to take Councillor Huggins' thoughts away, and we will work up some proposals.
Okay, in which case then that is an observation. Apologies. So we should give a B.
In which case, could I propose option B?
Yes, you can. Yes, sorry, my apologies for that. We've got a proposer, and Councillor Fernandez seconded. That's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you. Item 10. Councillor Williamson.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. So this is our budget monitor for the end of Q2, i.e. end of September. Headline figure is that at that time we were predicting an overspend for the year's budget of 192,000. It is a significant figure, but perhaps I could just draw the committee's attention to the fact that it's not at all uncommon to have what looks like quite a high overspend figure at this time of the year, and 9 times out of 10 when we get to the end of the year we've got back to a much better position. Anecdotally, although we haven't sort of got any figures yet for Q3, the general feeling is that the spending profile has changed such that by the time we get to the end of the year we'll more than likely be back to a sort of break-even position, but that is anecdotal, of course, because we haven't got anything to actually really substantiate that. So the reason we tend to get this pattern is that service budgets can often be a bit front-loaded, so much of the sort of expenditure tends to be in the first 6 months of the year and then tends to tail off. But being cautious, should the spending profile continue and we do end up facing more of an overspend towards the end of the year, then that does have to be dealt with as pressures within the services. And if we do end up with an overspend come the final outturn, that will be something that have to be taken within the general fund. But that's the most pessimistic position. In terms of the capital programme, there's been a little bit of slippage, mainly around Hertford Theatre and Harton. It's affected the profile. So there is a carry forward of 9.3 million. But as I say, for the reasons I've explained, more details in the appendices in terms of the capital items, and also there's the appendix on the revenue spend that has been compiled most helpfully, which shows the biggest movements both in and out, with the net effect of coming down to 192. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Woolbooth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Appendix B, the summary of significant variances, operations-wise, and the car parking at the Northgate End MCP in Bishop Stortford, how confident are we with the statement that it will achieve its budgeted income once the Old River Lane redevelopment is completed, given that we haven't actually taken away that much parking provision? If it's at that low level now, how confident are we that it will actually achieve its budgeted income levels?
I think what's being said there is that we're not expecting any improvement until that time, potentially, without necessarily saying that that will bring it back to the expected level, though of course that is what we're hoping. I think a lot of this at the moment is forecasts. It's very difficult to be specific and be about what may happen in the future, but I think this is just recognising that until we get Old River Lane complete, we're unlikely to get the Northgate End car park revenue up to the level we would have hoped.
Thank you.
That hasn't got anything to do with it being a phone-based charging regime there, is it? Is that right?
I don't believe there's any evidence of that. I think the pay by phone has been very successful.
Thank you. Councillor Bell, sorry, thank you.
On page 58, the net cost of services, that appears to be the sort of biggest jump. How much of that is down to the massive increase in inflation we've seen so far this year, and how much of that is sort of external to the impact of inflation on cost of services?
Unfortunately, my pages aren't numbered. Is this the forecast out there?
Just the table just before 2.3.
Oh, hang on. All right. Okay. Do you want to go through? No, all right, hang on, sorry. No. Okay, right. Okay, right. Apologies. Yes, as we can see, if you look at the summary of significant variances, first page, which is page 64, there are a number of items there due relation to the high inflation rates that we've been seeing. For example, the refuse and street cleaning contract and grounds maintenance contract.
Did you have a supplement?
Just how much of the other variants could have been sort of took place outside of the general increase in inflation? Was there anything else in particular that sort of caused issues that could cause issues again in over the next coming years?
Well, the other factor, of course, is to pay the staff salary increase of 7%, so that's had quite an impact too.
Page 59, we've talked about outstanding debt a number of times at these meetings, and I noticed that the total has increased by £250,000 since the last meeting, or the last position at the end of June. There's also quite a lot of old stuff, which I think you're working to get rid of. These numbers look quite high. Are you concerned? Do you have concerns? Should we be concerned about this?
Chairman, part of the staff restructurings, which will be done as part of this budget, is to centralise credit control within finance, so that I can be absolutely sure that credit control is being done properly, and we can muck this out and get rid of the stuff that genuinely is uncollectible, so we can see the wood for the trees. But I believe that since services were responsible for debt collection, in many cases it just doesn't seem to happen, or they just don't seem to be very effective at it. They send letters rather than telephoning people, etc. There are various ways to get money out of people, and by bringing it into finance and centralising it and providing that as a support service to the rest of the council, I'm fairly confident that it will require some write-offs to get this back to what is collectible stuff, and then I'm confident that we can get that debt back under control. At my last council, for example, we gave loans to people who were homeless, and we achieved a 52%. We achieved 52% collection rate on that. Now those debts are generally to people with chaotic lifestyles, and 52% is actually a really high recovery rate on those sort of debts. And we were absolutely totally and utterly on the ball. We were ringing people up, and we used other debt collection methods and agencies, and particularly nudge, etc. So I'm confident that once that's brought in under essentially in finance, and taken away from service areas, we'll see an improvement in the debt performance.
And when do you think that might happen?
The restructuring paper is being written this week, and we'll go to a leadership team for clearance, and then we will go through the statutory consultation period.
Thank you. I mean, on the summary of significant variances, I mean, obviously there's quite a chunky one for planning service staff costs, where we're still using lots of agency staff. And I think I see there's a recruitment drive going to happen fairly soon. Are we hopeful that that's going to resolve that situation?
Yes, Chair. You may have seen some of the videos around this. So it's a recruitment which is rebranding the planning and the council, and it's using modern techniques such as videos, etc. And we're fairly confident that it will have some effect, but obviously the proof is in the pudding. There is a shortage nationally of planning officers. We're seeing a shortage of lawyers, accountants, environmental health officers, etc. And it's generally the lag of when training was cut in previous austerity periods. So we tend to see that contracting, the number of people trained, and then we get into this situation. Also, the local government workforce is aging. God knows I wake up every morning and feel a lot older than I did the day before, but the workforce is aging, and I'm afraid to say that the media, particularly the print media, have made out that, you know, local government is not the place for young people to be, to have a career, etc. So we are facing those barriers as well of trying to attract people in with training, etc., to do the jobs. There is a significant shortage, I know, of Section 151 officers, because we're all jumping ship, because we're all burnt out and exhausted. So planners in particular, we've seen particular difficulties with, and indeed in Hertfordshire, there's been a tendency to up the money. And there's therefore the mini inflationary pressure of planners, and, you know, planners staying for so long and then getting offered, you know, a golden hello to go somewhere else. And rather than tackle, for me, there's something we should be doing jointly together to tackle the issue, which includes training and recruiting people in, but, you know, giving them the training packages, etc. So we increase the supply. And I think that's a change in mindset that needs to happen, or otherwise we are going to find that we can't get people.
Thank you. Thank you. On the capital forecast outturn, on the amount of nine and a bit million that's going to be carried forward, is that going to be spent? Was that because some of that paused? Or
That should have been taken out, Chairman, because there's no carry forward at all, because because it's been reset. That's my mistake for not having taken that particular line out. So I wouldn't get hung up about on on carry forwards at the moment, because some of that expenditure, you are right, has been moved into the into approved but committed but not approved, approved but not committed section. So I'm not entirely sure how you carry forward debt financing anyway. So
thank you. Thank you. Okay, but Councillor Bell, sorry.
So it's great to hear that we're pushing with a new recruitment plan to recruit more planners, because obviously that's a big shortfall in our budget. But what are we doing to retain the planning officers we currently have? Because it's cheaper to spend a little bit more money on making sure that our planning officers feel valued and enjoying working for East Herts, than it is to keep hiring new people and keep training new people. I did speak to a couple of other. I did speak to one of the planning officers who left the organisation recently, and they did say that they felt that support in some areas was lacking, and that was one of the reasons they left. So I wonder what we're doing to make sure that we're taking considerations from the current planning staff seriously, to make sure that we don't keep losing more.
the recruitment strategy, Councillor, includes sharing some of the saving that comes about from not using the agency staff. So by not using agency staff, it generates a saving, and some of that saving will go on market supplements to those staff who stay with us. So those market supplements will also be part of the recruitment strategy of recruiting planners in. So but that will be shared with the staff who are staying here as well. But it is dependent on us actually recruiting the external staff before it'll kick in for internal staff, the staff who are already here. And of course there is a productivity agreement as well, but it has to be, because we need to tackle get down the planning backlog as well. So the existing staff are included in this from the point of view of a remuneration award. And I'm unsure what you mean by there was no support. So, but I'll leave you to discuss that with the head of planning and building control.
Thank you. We're happy. Oh, Councillor Huggins.
Just on that point, on planners, in percentage terms, do we know the scale of the problem? How far behind are local government salaries to planners as opposed to their commercial alternative?
I believe that analysis has been done. I don't have it to hand, but I believe that analysis was done by the interim head of HR and OD and the head of planning and building control. It's very much dependent, of course, on how the private sector building market is going in as well. But they like local authority planning officers because they understand the system. So you know they have the experience of taking planning applications through development management committees as well, so they know how it works inside out, and they have a preference therefore to take local authority planning officers. I believe it's gamekeeper turned poacher or poacher turned gamekeeper. I'm not sure which way round it would be with a planning officer going to the private sector developers, but they do particularly want that experience that you can only get by being a local government planner.
Chair, if would it be possible? I know it's a HR question, but it's an item that keeps coming up within our financial risk and being able to attract these people. So would it be possible to get some kind of feedback report on the scale of the issue, just so that we've got an understanding of the size of the divide?
Is that something we could get for this committee? Is that something that maybe HR might have?
I think we'll take that away. Chair.
Yeah,
Thank
okay.
you.
We'll take that. That's a, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. In which case then, if we're happy to go to page 57, there are two recommendations, the second of which is needs an approval. So are we happy to agree to those two recommendations? Councillor Booth, Councillor Fernando. Thank you. All of those in favour? Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so now we go to item 11, shared internal audit. Simon, thanks very much for being so patient.
Thank you, Chair. That's no problem. It goes with the territory, it has to be said. This is the third progress report covering the internal audit work programme for 2022-23. In it is reference to how far we've got with the programme of audits, which when we calculated it a bit earlier this month, showed that we delivered 72% of the audit plan days. We've also highlighted the satisfactory outcome of 5 audits at paragraph 2.2. All of those in the report provided a substantial or reasonable level of assurance, which is the good news. At paragraph 2.4, I'm highlighting to members that one new audit, IT software lists and licenses, has been added to the work programme.
Does that happen? Excuse me. Does that happen very often in terms of adding new audits in mid-year? Is that a common occurrence?
It's not unusual. During the course of a year, we're often asked to respond to emerging risks or events, and for that reason, we build a contingency into the work programme. And in this particular case, that new audit has been resourced from the contingency budget that we had in the work programme. If there isn't sufficient contingency, we may reprioritise other audits to accommodate the new one that's come forward. But in this case, we can add it to the work programme.
And in terms of time, in terms of officer time to conduct the audit, that you'd have a bit of a contingency there, do you,
Yes.
in terms of hours or days or whatever?
Yes, we tend to express it in audit days, but yes, we build a contingency of approximately 10 audit days in each year's annual work programme.
Thank you.
That particular audit I was just speaking about, that's been timetabled to be delivered from mid-February. It's a shared audit which will be carried out in conjunction with the IT partner, Stevenage Borough Council. So that's a joint report that will be issued. I think the only other thing to highlight is the current status of the high priority recommendations shown in Appendix B. Members will see that the full implementation of both of those that are in that appendix is dependent on the upgrade or replacement of the ICON package, which is the cash management software, which I believe is very much on Stephen's radar. I'm happy to take questions should members have any. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, going back just on that subject, I mean, this has now been described as an urgent priority, hasn't it? So how quickly do you think you'll get some sort of response in terms of when this might be resolved, in terms of, because it's being an urgent priority?
The cash manage the recommendation, yes. It's very much dependent on the procurement arrangements for the replacement software.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add?
Chairman, I've been trying to make contact with Civica, who are the providers of the software, to get their account manager to come in and discuss this and scope out and get a plan for when this can be done. There was a period of 6 months in which Civica were doing a moratorium on any new software implementations, whilst they converted a number of older Icon installations from the MasterCard pay gateway to another pay gateway, because MasterCard had said, your software is so old, we're not comfortable with it using MasterCard. So there was a large amount of work that had to be done, and Civica imposed that 6-month moratorium, as I say. So it's a key part of transforming East Herts to have a modern, up-to-date, cloud-based payment system, and it's essential for me to have that cloud-based pay and cash management system in place before I proceed to place our financial system into the cloud, because I don't want to write interfaces twice. So the estimated time from getting the go from Civica to having it ready for implementation is approximately 3 months. I've done it before, and it'll be about 3 months.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, members, if we're happy to do so, we've got some recommendations on page 166. We'll need to vote on those. Councillor Walbooth and Councillor Bell. We're happy to be all in favour of that. Thank you. Are you happy with that, Councillor Crofton? Perfect, thank you. Is data protection update.
Thank you, Chairman. I was just going to say it's a fairly self-explanatory report, and I don't think the officers here, so unless any members have any questions to pass on, I would propose that we note the report. Yeah. Okay, we're happy with that. We don't need to vote on it. Thank you. No, that's noted. Item 13 is the Councillor. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Yeah, I don't think wasn't anything we needed to talk about, was there particularly? No. I think yeah, fine, sorry. I think I don't have anything on that. So we're happy we've got a proposal and a second. All those in favour? All in favour? Are we happy with the work programme? That's just the work programme, just getting that one. Are we happy with that? All those in favour? Councillor Crofton, you happy? Yep, we're done. That's approved. Thank you. No urgent business. I'm aware of. I think we've finished at 12.